Welcome to today's lesson. Today we will be looking at some air quality management concepts. By the end of today's session, we should be able to define some terms such as ambient and emission air quality standards. We should be able to discuss the significance of air pollution indexes, and also we should be able to discuss the importance of standards in air quality. So firstly, let's talk a little bit about our environment. What makes up our environment? As you can see on the diagram, we have our atmosphere. Firstly, we look at the atmosphere. So how do we define our atmosphere? The atmosphere is that gaseous envelope that surrounds the entire earth. This is the air we breathe. Then we also have the lithosphere. Let's look next at our lithosphere. This is the solid portion of the earth, the crust and the upper mantle of the earth. This would be the rocks, this would be the magma that would through volcanic eruptions, etc., would be released onto the earth's surface. These will cool, and eventually over time the weathering of these rocks would provide soil and the minerals that are contained in our soils. Then we also have our hydrosphere. What is our hydrosphere? This is the water on or surrounding the surface of the globe, which includes our oceans and the water in the atmosphere. Now, what is the relationship amongst all these various spheres and our biosphere? Let's look at the definition of biosphere. This is a part of the earth's crust, waters and atmosphere that actually supports life. So it is the intersection or the interrelationship amongst all those various spheres that make up our environment that creates conditions that are ideal for life to exist on earth, such as plants, animals, human life. Okay, so in the general context now, we are going to be, for the rest of this course, we are going to be looking specifically at the atmosphere, air quality, atmospheric conditions, and how the well-being or lack thereof, how this affects life on earth. So let's move on. So the atmosphere, our atmosphere is made up of different layers or different structures. Let's look first at our troposphere. The troposphere, this is the lowest layer of the air. This from ground level, from sea level, it rises to about 10 kilometers vertically, and this layer has about the greatest total mass or weight of our atmosphere. This is the level of the atmosphere that we live in. This is the level of the atmosphere that we breathe. So this particular layer of our atmosphere is very important for us, and this is going to be the focus of a lot of what we talk about during the semester. So above our troposphere we have other layers. We have the stratosphere, the mesosphere, and our thermosphere. This slide gives us an idea of what that structure looks like. As mentioned before, our troposphere, starting from sea level, can rise to about 10 kilometers. Beyond that we have our stratosphere. That's another level, so it rises from 10 to 30. Mesosphere is next, from 30 to 50 kilometers. Thermosphere from 50 to 400. Notice the layers are getting larger now. And beyond 400 kilometers, further out into the atmosphere, even out into space for that matter, this is what we call our exosphere. Now our troposphere, by volume, this layer of atmosphere consists of 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 1% argon, and 0.3% carbon dioxide. So these are the major gaseous components of our troposphere. Remember, this is the level that we live and breathe in, but there are also some other trace gases as well. All right, now this layer is of greatest interest to us, and we know why now, because again, this is where we live, carry out all our activities. So this is of greatest interest to us with regards to pollution control, since this is the layer in which most living things exist. All right, again, we have some further details on those various levels of the atmosphere. Again, starting from the troposphere, this is the lowest level, this is where we live. So most life forms exist here. Our weather systems, rainfall, tropical storms, snowfall, drought, all of these things exist in this layer. And this is where 75% of the atmosphere by weight exists, as we mentioned in a previous slide. Then beyond that, we have our stratosphere. This is also another layer that would be of interest to us, because this is where our ozone layer exists. All right, 24% of our atmosphere exists here. And remember, as we've often talked about in the past, the ozone layer is very important to us, because remember, this is a protective layer over the Earth's atmosphere that protects us from not allowing too much solar radiation to enter our atmosphere, where we can keep a balance in our atmosphere to sustain life, where it would not be too cold, it would not be too hot. Next, above the stratosphere, we have the mesosphere. This is a colder environment, colder layer of the atmosphere, where you have fewer molecules here. All right, and remember too, as you increase in elevation, as you go higher into the atmosphere, typically the temperatures will decrease, and also pressure will decrease as well, because gravity will be working closer to the Earth's surface, hence the reason you have fewer molecules. This is also the layer where you would find some of the heavenly bodies occurring, shooting stars, meteorites, etc. Beyond that level, we have our thermosphere, also fewer molecules, but you have larger temperature fluctuation. So what you find happening here is, instead of the expected pattern of temperatures decreasing with height, you would find in this layer, you would find some fluctuations happening here. Temperature increase and decrease would not look like what you expect. And again, at the highest levels, this is where you're now getting into space. Alright, let's look at the relationship between elevation and height in relation to those various levels. So if you follow with me, on the left axis, the y-axis, sorry, you have the height variations. On the x-axis, you have the temperature variations, increasing in this direction and decreasing in this direction. Okay, so we are in the troposphere. This is where we live. Note, this is where you have all our weather systems, life, etc. taking place. Note what is happening. Your temperatures are now decreasing in this direction as you increase in height. Okay, now the tropopause, stratopause and mesopause, these are actually the defining boundaries between the various layers. So now we move into our troposphere, where this is where our ozone layer exists. Notice we have a different pattern now. We're actually seeing where we have some temperature increasing with height. Now bear in mind, our ozone layer is here. And what is the function of our ozone layer? Remember what the ozone layer does. The ozone layer regulates the amount of heat that comes into our atmosphere by letting some in and reflecting and re-radiating some out. So this is what is going on here. So this is what would account for the difference in temperature change in this layer here. As we move further up into the atmosphere, we have our mesosphere. In this section, temperatures seem to have normalized now, and temperatures are decreasing with height. The thermosphere, as we had seen in the previous slide, it was mentioned that you have fluctuations in temperature at this level. Okay, so hopefully you understand what is happening here, right? Okay, let's move on. So this is pretty much the same information, but now we're trying to make it a little more real world application. So we have our various levels in height, starting from sea level, increasing in this direction, temperatures increasing along the x-axis in this direction. So this is where we exist in our troposphere. This is our environment in which we live. Various activities take place, even aircraft activities. You see where the planes would essentially fly within the troposphere. Very rarely would they go beyond that. For example, you see our clouds exist at that level as well. When we move beyond that into the stratosphere, we find different things happening. This is where our ozone layer is. If you look across the chart to the right, you can see that. Okay, you have specialized types of aircraft that will occur at this level. Some types of weather instruments. This is a radio sonde here. The red line, of course, represents those temperature changes throughout the various layers, and at the very extent of that, beyond that 400 where we move into the exosphere, this is where spacecraft and satellite will exist. Alright, so this is just an attempt here to make it a little more relatable for you. So we're still talking about our atmosphere, and in relation to our troposphere, let's talk about acid rain. So acid rain in the troposphere. So one of the most recent changes in the Earth's troposphere involves the phenomena of acid rain. So we would have touched on this briefly before already. So what is acid rain? This is acid deposition resulting from gaseous emissions of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, where they interact with water vapor, that is, and sunlight. Remember, the sunlight provides energy for a chemical reaction to then take place, which would now convert those acid depositions into strong acid compounds such as your sulfuric acid and your nitric acid. So those acids are what contributes to acid rain. And we know acid rain to be a problem because we know some of the effects of acid rain on the environment in terms of the changing the pH of your soils. It has the ability to kill plants, animals, create destruction to human structures, buildings, etc. Alright, so there is a problem there, as it contributes to acidification of your oceans, etc. Now let us look at the air pollution index according to the American Clean Air Act. Now this is specific to the United States, right? So bear that in mind. The Clean Air Act, which was last amended in 1990, this requires the Environmental Protection Agency, that's the EPA, to set national ambient air quality standards. Ambient air quality meaning environmental air quality standards. Why? So that pollutants which are considered harmful to public health and the environment, you can set standards or guidelines as to how you're managing those pollution emissions. So the Clean Air Act established two types of national air quality standards. You have the primary standards and the secondary standards. What are the primary standards? These set limits to protect public health including the health of sensitive populations. So sensitive populations would be certain groups that are most easily affected, usually first before the general public, all right, such as asthmatics, children, elderly, because these are examples of groups where your immune system would be compromised, making it even more difficult for you to resist some of these pollutants that have been released into the atmosphere, right? So those are your primary standards. The secondary standards, they set limits to protect the general public's welfare, including protection against decreased visibility. So now you're talking about your daily functions, your ability to function. So you're looking at visibility, damage to animals, crops, vegetations, buildings, etc. So these standards are intended to provide like 2 layers of protection for the general public. All right. So the EPA calculations for these index are based on regulations that are contained in the Clean Air Act. So remember how the process works. The act or the piece of legislation will define what needs to be done. Those decisions would have been made at government level, where the government lawmakers, based on advice, would have developed laws and legislations to protect the ambient air quality, right? These regulations now or policies would usually be how-to documents that now enables the responsible agencies to now carry out the requirements of the Clean Air Act. So coming out of that was the development of the Air Quality Index, the AQI, and this is an index that is used for reporting daily air quality. The next slide we would look at an example of that. So this index, it also tells you how clean or how polluted your air is and what associated health effects might be of concern to you. So let's look at this example here. So on the left here we have the index, air quality index levels of health concern. We have the actual values or measurements of the index, and then we have the description of what it really means. So green here is good, values between 0 to 50. And what does this mean? It says the air quality is considered satisfactory and air pollution poses little or no risk. Moderate, here we have an increase in numerical value. And what does this say? What does moderate mean? Air quality is acceptable. However, for some pollutants, there may be a moderate health concern for a very small number of people who are unusually sensitive to air pollution. Right? And then of course this progresses from good to moderate. Then we have unhealthy for sensitive groups. So the concern is sensitive groups, not the general public. We have unhealthy in general. It says everyone may begin to experience health effects. And then we go from unhealthy to very unhealthy and hazardous. Hazardous would be where health warnings of emergency conditions will have to be sent out nationwide. Sometimes this is where governments or entire cities would have to they would have to shut down operations for a period of time to allow some of the pollution to dissipate. Alright, so those were the index. Let's talk about the standards. So the index is, as I mentioned before, the index is for the purpose of identifying levels of risk. Standards now, this sets boundaries. So the Environmental Protection Agency sets ambient air quality standards. So as I mentioned before, we define ambient as the ambient air is the air that surrounds our environment. Right? That would be different from indoor air quality, where your indoor air quality can actually have different characteristics from your ambient air quality, which would be outside of your house. So as mentioned before, remember we have primary standards. So the primary standards is intended to protect public health, That's the first layer. Then we have the secondary standards, which is to protect the public welfare, um, such as your plants, animals, property, materials. So that's the entire human and natural environment. These standards provide threshold levels below which no adverse effects are known to occur. So these levels would be determined or informed by scientific research, where scientists will determine that certain levels of pollution of certain types may be acceptable, but beyond a certain level or beyond a certain concentration, it now is likely to have adverse health effects or environmental effects. So that's essentially what the standard is. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is now the agency responsible for the enforcement of air quality standards. So compared this to the local environment in Trinidad and Tobago, our Environmental Management Agency would be the agency that's responsible for carrying out and enforcing the requirements of our Environmental Management Act. As part of our Environmental Management Act, we have our air pollution rules, which you would find on the EMA website. So that also means that our Environmental Management Authority, they are the ones responsible for enforcing the guidelines of our air pollution rules. Okay, let's look at monitoring and control. Right, factors and inventories. What are these factors we're talking about? We're talking specifically about the emission factors. What is this? This is the statistical average of the mass of pollutants, or the weight of pollutants that are emitted from each source per quantity of material handled, processed, or burned. What does that mean? For example, an emission factor would be how much, or what is the average weight of carbon pollutants released into the atmosphere as a result of the burning of a specific weight or a specific quantity of coal. That's just one simple example. So how much coal, burning of coal, will produce how much pollutants that would result from that. So that is your emission factor. Now the emissions inventory, this would be a database actually that would be created that will locate the air pollution sources for a given area. So for example, the EMA is responsible for actually keeping an inventory of all polluters, especially various operations that would be carried out across Trinidad and Tobago that would produce pollution, whether it's water pollution, air pollution, etc. They are required to register with the EMA so that an inventory can be built in order for monitoring to be carried out, right? So this is what the emissions inventory is. It defines the type and magnitude of pollution that these sources are likely to produce. So we identify the sources of polluters, the types of pollution, and the amount or magnitude of pollution. This data would also give you information on how they are likely to produce pollution over time. How often do they do it? What is that likely to look like in the future, that those pollution trends? And additionally, the inventory gives you information on the relative contribution of pollutant emissions for each source. So for example, you may find from the database that you collect fuel emissions, combustion fuels, produce X amount of pollution per year as opposed to agricultural pollution, etc. So this is the kind of information that would be produced from your emission inventory. So this emission inventory would provide information that is useful in the development of local emissions reduction strategies. This data that's provided from the inventory would highlight areas for concern that need to be addressed. So anytime, for example, you see data exceeding those standards over a prolonged period of time, you know that this is an area that needs to be addressed. You have to figure out, is there a weakness in our monitoring? Is there a weakness in penalties? Where is the weakness? What do I need to do in order to change the direction of that increase? Okay, and additionally, our inventory provides a listing of potential emissions reduction measures for direct particulate pollution. Remember, one of the previous lessons we talked about PM2.5 and my mistake, the second one should be PM10. All right, remember we had two sizes of particulates. So I'd like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. If you could please proceed to today's activity. Thank you.